Está con nosotros la profesora Ilana Snyder de la Universidad de Monash en Australia, digamos, de las dos principales universidades de Australia. La doctora Snyder tiene una formación inicialmente como filóloga, pero lleva escribiendo desde hace bastantes años, 25 años, en torno a las temáticas de alfabetización, hipertexto, de la página a la pantalla, y más recientemente tiene las guerras de alfabetización porque enseñar a los niños a leer y a escribir es un campo de batalla en Australia, o cerrando la diferencia en educación, mejoras que ocurren en las sociedades del sur. Ella proviene de la secundaria. Su investigación ha estado centrada en el campo social, en las prácticas sociales y culturales de las tecnologías, y está particularmente interesada en la conexión entre alfabetización, tecnología y desigualdades. Entre los estudios financiados más importantes que tiene, uno sobre las conexiones entre el uso de las nuevas tecnologías, entre el aprendizaje, el cambio nacional en las universidades australianas, las prácticas.
My field of research is literacy education.
El campo de investigación es la alfabetización y la educación.
So my concern in Australia, I train teachers to teach in an English classroom, so first language like classroom, and that's part of my teacher education program. And I'm always interested in the connections between literacy and technology.
Ella está interesada
en
la conexión entre alfabetización, tecnología y enseñanza, porque enseña a docentes que enseñan en los colegios inglés, y está interesada en esta temática.
And the way that my talk is framed is the way I think almost everything in this world needs to be framed. We have to think about the past, we have to think about the present, and only then can we think about the future.
Pues eso, vamos a intentar pensar en el pasado, en el presente y en el futuro de estas temáticas.
Okay, I'm going to begin my talk today with 4 stories.
Voy a hablar de 4 historias.
This is a story from the past,
Esta es una historia del pasado.
It's 1996.
La alfabetización de los jóvenes en las dimensiones de su vida, en las escuelas, en casa y en la comunidad.
This is my first book. It was published in 1996.
El libro de 1996, su primer libro.
It's a word that maybe none of you are even familiar with.
In English, it's lost
in America and in the English
hypertext.
world,
Hypertext is something that the word
has
you
lost
know.
its currency.
¿Sabéis lo que
It
significa?
doesn't have the power that it had in the 1990s.
En inglés se ha perdido esta.
Okay, so the book begins with a history of writing. It talks about the nature of hypertext, and this is important because it still connects to the internet. Multiple reading paths, chunks of text, and electronic links.
Sí, el libro empieza hablando de la historia de las tecnologías de la escritura, y hace un recorrido por esto que aparece, esta definición de múltiples caminos para la lectura, textos chunk.
Yeah, and it's like a digital form of an encyclopedia. So that what we did with a print book, you can do with, it's the beginning of the idea of hypertext, that you don't start at page 1 and go through to page 400. You jump around all over the place for what interests you, for what you need, for the purpose of your investigation.
Sí, el libro habla de la enciclopedia impresa como un embrión del hipertexto.
And this is for Spanish speakers. It begins in this book. I talk about Borges.
Para los hablantes españoles es un libro que habla de ese tema.
In the 1990s, everybody, Spanish
Todo el mundo
speaking
en
or
los 90
not
conocía
Spanish,
este libro de Jorge
Paid
Lugo.
lip service
Okay,
to
now
it.
this is very interesting. A man called Michael Joyce, who was very American, and had a very big influence, left the area completely. He now just writes novels. And he wrote a book that was published, I think, in the 90s, in the mid-90s.
Ya.
And he looked at two kinds of hypertext. This is very, very interesting, that this idea, that this continuum comes from the 1990s, but it relates today to consumers and producers. The notion of being a consumer and a producer. He was talking about exploratory and constructive hypertext, so that an exploratory and constructive is something open, controlled, and about constructive about the way people engage in learning themselves and are active learners. Okay, and so the thing that's so interesting, or for me anyway, because history is important, the thing that is interesting to me still about hypertext is that people like Michael Joyce had an imagination, that they could imagine, that they imagined the internet. Long before the internet was there, they imagined the internet.
Mucho antes de internet, pues Michael Joyce estaba ya la idea de internet y del uso de internet.
Okay, so Ted Nelson in the 1960s, an American crazy man in the 1960s, and he imagined what the internet would be. Everything ever written, ever, would be available digitally. He imagined that in the 1960s, long before it was possible.
En los 60 ya Ted Nelson imaginó que toda la información podría estar conectada a través de los...
And this was his project. He called it the Xanadu project. All of you have seen Citizen Kane. Remember Citizen Kane, the movie?
Ciudadano Kane, la película, ¿recuerdan?
So, Xanadu. In the 50 years later, Google tried to do this. They called it the Google settlement. They tried to get everybody in the world who'd ever written anything to sign over their rights to Google so that they could create all Google failed. Everything ever did not achieve available. Google did not achieve resettlement. So there's a lot of stuff available on the internet, but not everything.
No funciona todo lo bien que debería funcionar. No está haciendo todo lo bien que debería hacer.
Okay, so one of the early things that people did with hypertext is they wrote a new form of literature, a new form of writing, and it was called hyperfiction. And it comes from another Spanish man, Spanish writer, Spanish-speaking man. Sorry, I should say that. I should say.
Que hablan español.
Yeah.
Los españoles hablan español.
And he wrote a book called Hopscotch. And Hopscotch is about the instructions to the reader to begin but you can also go through the book. You can if you order, and so that there's not a linear narrative.
En Rayuela, que es como se conoce en español, que es un juego, Julio Cortázar lo que propone en la presentación de esta novela es que cualquiera pueda hacer el recorrido que quiera, saltándose los capítulos, empezando por el final.
And the point here is that what people were doing with the book, with this, was they were already imagining what you now all do and you think is natural, what you do every day of your lives with the internet and digital technologies. People many 100 years ago were already thinking about these things, even though all they had was this to do it with. So they still had this imagination. Then in the book I talk about education and what its potential has, about hypertext and its potential for education. Lots of ideas before people were really using it about its potential in education, particularly about one of the things that interested me was about the writing of argument, that an argument that begins, that an argument begins with a proposition, and then you give evidence for the proposition, and you conclude that the proposition is right. In hypertext, I think, is more like the real world, where it's very hard to prove one thing, that there are many possibilities.
Parece más al mundo real porque puede haber muchas posibilidades, muchas conexiones.
Very important, very important notion. So that it's a pastiche, that there are different things that you put together to come towards an argument. You take a bit from here and a bit from there.
Es un pastiche, un collage, una forma de organizar diferentes cosas que se ponen juntas.
So that's to give you some background. That's the first story. The first story was the beginning with my first book, and the idea, the imagination, the thinking about what the internet would be before the internet. Okay, this is an Australian academic who's now a professor in two disputes, two feuds, two things that caused a lot of controversy about the internet and the use of digital technologies. So Victoria Carrington, there was a Scottish girl, a Scottish schoolgirl, a schoolgirl in Scotland, who was asked to write an essay by her teacher, and this is what she submitted to her teacher as an essay. She texted.
Le preguntaron una vez por algo que escribió una niña de 13 años usando SMS, ¿no?
That was her essay. And this story, they said, oh, the internet, texting, all of these things are terrible. What's going to be the end of education, because people don't use language properly, they shorten things, they abuse language, and at the end it's like the deluge.
Internet va a ser el final de la educación, de la alfabetización de los niños, hay que evitarlo para la escuela.
Social breakdown, the end of the world.
Es el final del mundo, hay que evitarlo de todas formas.
Okay, so that's one story. The second story.
¿Alguno de ustedes utiliza MySpace?
Yeah, it's again history. Today it's all Facebook.
Antes de Facebook.
Yeah. So two girls in Melbourne committed suicide. They had a pact together and they committed suicide, and they announced, they did organise their suicide pact in MySpace so that their friends saw it.
Esto lo pusieron lo postearon en la web.
So you can imagine what the newspaper said. MySpace caused these two girls to commit suicide.
MySpace produjo esta reacción de la gente.
So that was the second. Okay, so that was the second example. And of course we know that that's ridiculous. That it's not the technology that caused them to commit suicide.
No es la tecnología la que causa un problema de suicidio.
The third story. This is the most important story because this is a story about Bill Gates and Microsoft.
Una historia sobre Bill Gates y Microsoft.
Okay, in the mid-90s, Bill Gates, I mean, he does this all over the world. He gives money to change things. He wants to change everything, including poverty, and he's done amazing work with poverty.
Sí, en los años 90 dedicó dinero a diferentes cosas, entre otras, acabar con la pobreza en el mundo.
But he also wants to change education, because he thinks that the model that Microsoft has used to be so successful is the model that we should use in our schools. We should base our schools on the business and the management approach of Microsoft.
De alguna forma, la forma en que Microsoft organiza el campo de los negocios puede ser una buena forma para organizar también el campo escolar, ¿no?
Okay, so this school was established, I'm not sure when it was established, in 2006. This school was a beautiful Philadelphia, very technological. Everything possible was in this building, and the students who came to this school were the poorest, mainly black students in Philadelphia.
Montó una escuela en un barrio muy pobre de Filadelfia, una escuela muy bonita, como se puede ver en la diapositiva, y gente de todo tipo de procedencias, fundamentalmente en inglés fue.
From what Joaquin's told me about Spain, maybe it's something that will be of interest to people in Spain, because you were not allowed to, you didn't graduate from high school in America, from this school, which is very important in America, to finish high school. You were not allowed to graduate unless you applied to college.
Bueno, ya le he estado hablando antes del fracaso escolar en España y de la cantidad de adolescentes que no acaban la secundaria, que no van a la universidad, y allá esta escuela hace una tarea similar.
Okay, so this is a story of social engineering, of trying to make things different by...
Esto es una historia de ingeniería social, de intentar hacer las cosas de manera diferente a como se vienen haciendo en la escuela.
But there's a lot of criticism of this school from the students who have graduated, because it began in 2006, because they didn't like being managed like this, and many didn't like the environment, and they said that Microsoft shouldn't be interfering in education. And this is one reason. This is what I found on the internet. So that's the school. Look at this one. Because it's about, if you place Microsoft products in the school, then the students, when they leave school, will use Microsoft.
Sí, a la gente le enseñas cómo utilizar Microsoft en la escuela, la gente luego se va fuera de la escuela y sabe cómo utilizar productos de Microsoft, ¿no?
Okay, so this was a criticism in the Spanish press, and they said Microsoft shouldn't be making us addicted to Microsoft product. Microsoft teaches Spanish schools how to smoke Windows. Okay, now the story number 4. Colleagues of mine from Canada work with university professors in Uganda.
Es un proyecto de investigación de canadienses en Uganda, en un país de África.
Now they want to help give these students access to the internet.
Es un proyecto para dar acceso a internet a los chicos.
And there's no connections in the schools, not just in the main cities, but in the outside the cities. There's just no internet connection.
Fuera de las ciudades no hay conexión a internet en Uganda.
So they chose a second best option, which is a digital library.
Eligieron esta opción, que es una biblioteca digital.
Not internet access. One in the 1990s, one in the present, the past. No, one in the past and 3 or more or less in the present.
Ha contado 4 historias, una en los años 90, otra que son más o menos en el presente.
So my question is, what do we do now? These are the kinds of issues that people face in education everywhere, not just in Australia, in Spain, I think as well. What do these stories highlight? My question is, what do these stories highlight about the cultural, the social and the political contexts in which we work and live and study? Because most of you are students, yeah?
¿Cuáles son los elementos culturales, sociales y políticos que nos hacen preguntarnos estas 4 historias?
So the first thing I want to say is that there's a complex relationship between teachers, technology and change. The second thing I want to talk about is the remarkable endurance of the printed book. It's the power of the book. The book lives on.
Y la segunda cosa de la que quiere hablar es del papel, de la presencia de las tecnologías impresas.
Okay, so firstly I want to talk about literacy, technology and change.
Lo primero a hablar de esta relación entre alfabetización, tecnología y cambio.
Now, in general, and this is a generalization, and there's always danger when you generalize. In general, teachers, particularly first language teachers,
los profesores de idioma en general, con todos los peligros que tiene generalizar,
have been resistant to using technology.
Son
reluctant.
Resistentes a utilizar la tecnología.
Reluctant. And so you have to ask why. Why have they been reluctant?
¿Por qué ocurre esto?
I'm not sure what the answer is, but even when they do use technology, it's to do what they've always done.
Incluso cuando utilizan tecnología,
so that they don't, even if they use a laptop, they use a laptop as if it was a book.
Utilizan el ordenador, utilizan los portátiles como si fueran libros.
So they might post an assignment on the internet.
Ponen exámenes en internet.
Communicate with students by email.
Se comunican por email con los estudiantes.
And get them to do an assignment which they post back on the web.
Y ponen tareas en la red.
But for me that's not digital literacy.
Pero esto no es alfabetización digital.
That's doing what we always did, but just with a computer.
Con el computador.
Okay. So why is it that teachers in other disciplines have been more enthusiastic?
¿Por qué no son entusiastas?
And why is it that there has not been a revolution in education? Why hasn't there been a revolution associated with the use of these technologies in education?
¿Por qué no ha ocurrido una revolución asociada al uso de los ordenadores en educación?
Larry Cuban is a very famous American writer on the history of education.
Larry Cuban es un famoso investigador norteamericano sobre el tema de la historia de la educación.
Emphasizing the importance that we only understand the present by looking at the past. And this is his title says everything about this book. Oversold and underused.
Sí, sobrevendidos y mal usados. Es un título de una obra de Larry Cuban que describe muy bien su pensamiento.
Okay, and there's another story about another very famous American who has been, I think you've been Simon Papert. Did you do logo?
Simon Papert, el lenguaje logo, es otro importante pensador norteamericano.
Okay, he tells a parable of the time travelers who come from the 19th century into the 21st century. You can guess what I'm going to say. You can guess what I'm going to say. They go into an operating theatre in a hospital. They recognize nothing.
Y lo comparaba con un médico, ¿no? Entonces, que un médico del 19 que se despierta en una sala de operaciones en el siglo XXI.
And you know what I'm going to say next?
Nada.
They go into a classroom in a school and they recognize everything.
Pero el maestro del 19 que se despierta en la clase del siglo XXI reconoce todo.
Okay, maybe now I'm exaggerating here. This is my style.
My style.
My style, exaggerate, hyperbolic. Like hypertext. I'm exaggerating.
Es una exageración, es hiperbólico.
But I'm exaggerating to provoke you to think about change, education and change. So I'm exaggerating for a reason.
Está exagerando para provocar que pensemos sobre este tema del cambio.
Because I'm not attacking teachers. I'm not saying that teachers are terrible, because there are very, very real reasons why teachers don't find it difficult to use technologies.
El problema no son los profesores, el problema.
And it's something about institutions.
El problema
the
realmente
nature of
terrible son las
institutions. Yeah, the institutions resist change.
Las instituciones son las que están resistiéndose al cambio, no los profesores.
And teachers in schools, in particular, more so than in universities, are very, very busy. They don't have time to reflect and to make the changes necessary. I mean, to think about how they can change.
Los profesores, incluso en la universidad, pues están muy ocupados y no pueden estar pensando en todas las cuestiones que están alrededor del cambio.
Okay, but I must say that of course there are many changes that was the children's machine. There are many changes that have taken place, and one of them, and I think we're going to be talking about this further over the next few days, is the project that originated at MIT in Boston, which is the $100 computer. Do you know about the $100 computer?
Yeah? Ella pregunta sobre si conocéis el proyecto de un ordenador por $100, de lo que habrá algunas en algunas ocasiones durante estos próximos 3 días de su estancia con nosotros.
This idea is a revolutionary idea.
Esta es una idea revolucionaria, la del ordenador de $100.
These are $100 laptops. The laptops, the same model as the laptops from MIT being used in remote indigenous communities in Australia.
Se está utilizando en pueblos aborígenes australianos este proyecto de un ordenador por niño, el ordenador de $100. Y es una idea revolucionaria que surgió, he dicho antes, de la investigación de los laboratorios de diseño tecnológico de Massachusetts.
I guess I'm arguing, this is what we have to talk about when I finish, is that just giving groups, individuals, computers is not enough to make change.
No lo hacen los individuos, sino que intervienen diferentes elementos, diferentes actores.
And we have to think about the whole ecology of education.
Hay que pensar en la ecología total de la educación.
So how institutions are organized, how they're funded.
Cada institución tiene que organizarse para
how teachers are educated and valued. In Australia, I'm not sure about Spain, but in Australia, teachers have low status, low pay and low status in
los
Australia.
profesores en Australia, no solo en otros países, tienen un estatus muy bajo.
Yeah, so that in Australia that has to change, and we can talk about. You can tell me about Spain, whether that's the same in Spain. I don't know if it's
Ella no
the same.
sabe si en España el estatus de los profesores es tan bajo como pasa en Australia.
Hardware and software, the computers and the software have to be made for education, not for business, like Microsoft.
Ella piensa que los ordenadores están para hacer educación, no hacer negocios, o no estar para el mundo de los negocios. O sea, el enfoque tiene que ser para la educación, el de los ordenadores.
Okay, so now I want to talk about the second point. Firstly, I talked about
Entonces ya ha hablado del primer punto, que era la enseñanza, las tecnologías y el cambio.
Now I want to talk about the book and why it's so powerful, why it still lives, why it goes on.
Porque esta tecnología, que son los libros, perdura.
A lot of people, when they're criticizing digital technologies and computers and the use of the computers, talk about the book. This is a book that was written a long time ago, a book written in the 90s, and many, many books like this book have been written since. But this is a particularly good one because it's a beautifully written book, an American writer, talking about the connection between the book and culture. That our culture is so deeply entwined with the book and the history of the book and the many, many books that have created our culture.
Hay una identificación tradicional entre cultura y mundo del libro.
The fear is that people, like some of the young people here today, that because you text, you use the internet, you Google all day, that somehow you're going to be illiterate, that you don't value books.
Bueno, que la gente joven de hoy en día pues, manda mensajes de texto, utiliza internet, utiliza Google, pero si no maneja libros, pues son analfabetos.
Is using a digital reader different? Is that still valuing books, even though we're just reading them differently? That's something to talk about.
Estos son lectores de libros electrónicos y ellos...
Are they the same? The electronic reader and the book?
Es muy parecido, ¿no?
So that's, we think of the book as central to our culture.
El libro es central en la cultura.
But technology, we love the book. We love culture. We're a culture internationally, globally, that loves the book.
Amamos el libro internacionalmente.
But the computer, we have a different relationship.
Con el ordenador tenemos una relación diferente.
Which film is this from?
Esta película habla.
Hello, Dave. What's that from? 2001. 2001, Stanley Kubrick film, 2001, about the crazy computer that kills everybody.
2001, Odisea en el espacio, la frase en la que se dice.
There was a study in Australia, a relatively recent study, where two groups, children and adults were given e-books and e-readers to read.
En Australia los niños y hay como dos colectivos de lectores de e-book, niños y adultos.
And the young people, this is as predicted, you can imagine what I'm going to say now. The young people adjusted to reading on the screen very quickly, and the older people found it much more problematic.
Los jóvenes se adaptan bastante bien a la lectura de pantallas y los adultos pues tienen algunos problemas.
Okay, so that's something else I want to leave you with to talk about. So now we're moving on to opportunities and challenges.
Ahora quiero hablar de las posibilidades y los desafíos.
And the way I want to talk about this is that I think that one of the things that will help us and educators, I'm talking about educators and teachers here, to think about the challenges and to think about what we might do in terms of what we might do and what we might not do, is to take great note with the language that we use to communicate with each other and the world outside.
Bueno, os quiero hablar de lo que podemos hacer, de lo que no podemos hacer en torno a estas cuestiones y los desafíos que encontramos.
Yeah, and what I'm interested in is what I call keywords, and this is not an original idea. As many of my ideas, it comes from the very famous English theorist, literary theorist, Raymond Williams, and he wrote a wonderful, wonderful book called Keywords. And he said that the words aren't isolated. The keyword definitions, like a word like culture, because the word culture can't just be connected to so many other words. So we have to understand the connections between words.
Bueno, que va a hablar de una obra bien conocida en el mundo anglosajón y entre la gente que trabaja en temas de teoría literaria, que es la obra de Raymond Williams, que en esta obra, en Keywords, en palabras clave, explica que los significados de las palabras están embebidos, están encontrados en relaciones y en procesos de cambio.
Okay, so I've chosen a list of words, but someone else would choose a completely different list, probably. So this is very idiosyncratic, my list. The ones I want to talk about very briefly are these four: database, literacy, narrative and software.
Ella va a hablar solamente de 4 de esas palabras y que le parecen fundamentales para entender el papel de la tecnología, que son bases de datos, alfabetización,
the way I've put the hierarchy, the way I've sequenced these words is important. I'm saying that in the context of new technologies, of digital technologies, the notion of the database is very, very important. And we have to understand the database.
Estas palabras están ordenadas, o sea, y la primera es base de datos y es fundamental empezar por ella para entender los temas de tecnología.
Okay, what is a database? A database is a collection of data organized to maximize fast search and retrieval by a computer.
Una base de datos es una estructura organizada de datos para maximizar un acceso rápido y su recuperación en un ordenador, como son.
There are many different kinds of databases, but the
bases de datos.
The basic notion of a database is very, very important.
Pero esta noción es muy importante.
They appear, as a user, for all of us, all they appear to us as are collections of information, collections of data to view, to navigate and to search.
Es fundamental para los usuarios de ordenadores como colección de datos para ver, para navegar y para buscar. Es una idea muy importante.
You're seeing all of my database of stars of education and research.
Sorry.
Okay.
Ledmanovich es para ella una persona muy importante en esta cuestión de la base.
originally,
viene de Rusia,
but he works, I think, now still at the University of San Diego. It's San Diego in America, not San Diego.
Santiago, no.
San Diego in America, in California.
Trabaja en California, en la Universidad
And he's a
de
very,
California en San Diego.
a very, very interesting researcher in this field because he was trained in film studies in Russia, and then he comes into digital media from a Russian film training.
Sí, bueno, él trabajaba en Rusia, si no entiendo mal, en el mundo de en las películas, en torno al cine, y es un estudioso de ese campo, ¿no?
Okay, and this book, he's written many books, but this book is
Tiene
an
muchos
old
libros,
book, but a terrific book, The Language of New Media.
es
He
un libro
talks
magnífico, el lenguaje de los nuevos medios.
the thing that I found so important for me in changing my view of this stuff is that before the digital, before the computer,
Los hallazgos que tiene esta investigación, esta obra,
significant, the
fundamentales
dominant
antes
cultural
de lo
form,
digital,
the narrative, the story.
para comprender las narrativas fílmicas.
Okay, so now with the digital and the computer, the dominant form is the database.
La forma fundamental de la narrativa digital son las bases de datos.
And that's very significant.
Para ella es muy significativo.
Because we have all grown up on the story that has a beginning, a middle and an end. A database does not have a beginning, a middle and an end. It doesn't engage us, it doesn't pull us in. We look at a database and we have to create a story from the different bits of data.
Bueno, para ella es una idea muy interesante porque para crear ahora mismo una historia podemos ir cogiendo de diferentes sitios, pero en las narrativas normalmente había un antes, un durante y un después, ¿no? Y entonces lo que pasa con las bases de datos es que permiten mezclar cosas.
You have to think, if it's a new idea, I hope that's something that you will take away from today, to think about the importance of the narrative in your own life. The way you talk about your past and your present and your future is always as a story, always as a story.
Lo que pasa en las historias, en la vida de la gente tiene que ver con su pasado, su presente y su futuro. Y para ella esto está de alguna forma cambiando en este momento, ¿no?
But when you're using these digital technologies and you're moving from one place to another, you create your own stories.
Con las tecnologías digitales pues te vas moviendo y vas cogiendo de aquí y de allá y vas creando historias.
So my example, an example to make you help you think about this, is that when you go to a museum today, you have a CD-ROM. You collect a CD-ROM, yeah. And that creates. You have you can think of the museum as a large database with all of the pictures on the wall.
Yo estuve esta mañana en un museo, entonces había un CD-ROM donde estaban recogidas una amplísima base de datos donde estaban recogidas diferentes.
And the CD-ROM then creates the story around individual paintings, but also how they connect to each other. So the CD-ROM creates the story for you.
El CD-ROM crea la historia a partir de diferentes elementos que tiene dentro y tú puedes crear la historia, reconstruir la historia de un pintor a partir de todos los elementos que tiene dentro.
Okay, finished with that.
Acabaría aquí la reflexión sobre las bases de datos.
And the second word is literacy. My understanding of literacy is that it is more than just learning to read and write.
Su comprensión de la alfabetización va más allá, o sea, ella es consciente de que también en inglés es un poco difícil esta traducción y ella plantea que la alfabetización va más allá de saber leer, escribir y hacer matemáticas. Estar alfabetizada.
That explanation of literacy makes it seem as if to learn to read and write is neutral, is not ideological in any way. It's a neutral thing.
Es una cosa, no tiene un contenido ideológico la alfabetización, es una cosa natural.
Okay, a natural, yeah, natural. A natural thing or a neutral thing as well. Yeah. Okay, so my definition of literacy is that it is something that's very political and connected to the context, the history, the position of the people, the social class. All of these things affect people's ability to learn to read and write.
Según su postura, su investigación y la forma en que ella lo entiende, la alfabetización tiene un componente ideológico, político, social, está conectada a todas las actividades o sociales en las que nos vemos involucrados.
And this is another book in which which I wrote with Colin Lancashire, that the most important thing about this book is it focuses on the connection between language, literacy and technology. That literacy is now, we can almost only think of literacy connected to the new technologies.
Entonces, esta es una obra que escribe con Colin Lancashire, que es una persona que ha escrito sobre temas de alfabetización y donde se habla de estas cuestiones, de las conexiones de la tecnología y con las alfabetizaciones.
It's more than just being able to read and write. It's about being able to search the internet, to be able to navigate with hypertext, to evaluate, to put knowledge, to put bits of information together to create knowledge.
Claro, para ella estar alfabetizado hoy en día supone muchas más cosas, ¿no? Supone saber buscar en internet, poder navegar por los hipertextos, es decir, poder relacionar contenidos, poder evaluar esos contenidos.
And the most important practice of all, the most important of these skills is to make informed judgments.
Pero lo más importante para ella en esta alfabetización de hoy en día es la capacidad para hacer juicios informados sobre la información que se recibe.
Okay, now onto the third word. And that's again back to Lev Manovich and narrative. So my third word was firstly the first word was database, literacy, now narrative.
Vuelvo otra vez a Lev Manovich para hablar de esta palabra de narrativa.
The way Lev Manovich defines narrative is the construction of an interface to a database. That's hard.
Sí, lo pone aquí, fácil para mí. La cuestión clave para Lev Manovich es la construcción de una interfaz para una base de datos.
Okay, and I think I've said enough about this already. I've talked about what Lev Manovich has said there. And the last one I want to talk about is software. And
la última palabra de la que hablar es de software.
He's written a book that he's called Software. And if you think about it, again, just as I said that learning to read and write is not natural and is not neutral, software that we use, Google, the search engines that we use, the software that we use, whether it's Microsoft or Word or Apple or whatever we're using, are created by people and have particular ideologies and particular prejudices and frames.
El software que utilizamos, Google y otros dispositivos, pues ha sido creado por gente con un punto de vista, tiene una visión del mundo, una visión política, una visión cultural.
And he says that we now live in a software culture. Software that dominates everything that we do.
El software domina todo lo que hacemos en nuestra vida.
And the most important thing is to be aware of this, not just to go through it and not notice, to be aware that software is everywhere.
Podemos estar seguros que el software está rodeando todo lo que estamos haciendo.
Okay, and I've got one last section.
La última parte de esta intervención.
Just to say very briefly, talk very briefly about key theories.
Muy poquito sobre tres ideas.
The first theory I wanted to mention is what is now known as literacy studies, and okay, go on.
Sí, bueno, que voy a hablar en primer lugar sobre los estudios de nuevas alfabetizaciones.
Okay.
O los nuevos estudios sobre alfabetizaciones. No, los estudios sobre nuevas alfabetizaciones.
Okay, in the 1960s, late 1960s, 1970s, the interest moved from things that, an understanding of what we do in our heads, in our thinking, the cognitive, started moving to an interest in the social, in the context in which we
Durante los años 60 y 70 se pasó del interés por lo neuronal al interés por lo cognitivo y social.
the importance of the context.
La importancia del contexto.
So there's a shift from the cognitive to the social.
Lo que se remarcaba, lo que se señalaba como más importante pasó de lo cognitivo a lo contextual.
So, as I was saying before when I explained the new understanding of literacy, the people who started working in the area, who were working in the area of literacy in this period of a social turn across the social sciences.
Bueno, toda la gente que trabajaba en este campo empezó a interesarse por los temas sociales.
Okay. So what they do is this is Brian's on the way we see literacy as a social practice rather than a head thing. It's something that we do within a context with other people in a particular
Bueno, tiene
context.
una importancia decisiva en la dimensión social de la alfabetización y ha pasado de ser algo que está en nuestra cabeza a que está en nuestra interacción con el contexto, con lo social.
Okay, and he has two models of literacy, the autonomous. This is a word that you all know. So he talks about the autonomous model of literacy and the ideological model of literacy.
El paso, el cambio de la alfabetización como una actividad para la autonomía a algo que tenía un vínculo con lo social.
And I've already explained that when he talks
Ahora lo va a
about
explicar.
the autonomous, it's when we see literacy as something neutral that everybody can learn. That we teach people how to read and write, and then that has to happen first, then that happens first, and then they can have time, then they can learn.
Y ellos luego pueden aprender.
But of course people are learning before they can read and write. You don't have to be
La
reading.
gente ya está leyendo, está aprendiendo antes.
And they happen at the same time.
Y pasa todo a la vez, pasa simultáneamente.
And that everything is political, is his argument, that everything is ideological.
Este tema es un tema ideológico.
And so that somebody in a poor part of Madrid doesn't have the same context as somebody in a wealthy area in Madrid as their access to literacy.
Bueno, que no todo el mundo tiene el mismo acceso a la alfabetización en el centro de Madrid que en otros sitios, en un barrio de alto nivel en Madrid que en otros barrios en Madrid, ¿no?
Okay, we could talk much more about the ideological nature of literacy. See, this is all my heroes, and most of them are men, which is terrible. Actually, I need to get some female heroes next time I do a presentation, which is bad. I didn't realise. Gunter Kress is another English, well, he's German actually, but he lived in Australia for many years and he now lives in London.
Bueno, es uno de sus héroes, es un profesor alemán que vive en Australia
what he has drawn attention to his whole career is very political, but besides that he's drawn attention in relation to the digital to the importance of the visual, of the image. I see literacy as making meaning. One definition of literacy is to make meaning and to understand. He says today the visual is part of the way in which we make meaning and we communicate and we represent things.
Pues de la misma forma que alfabetizarse es dar sentido, lo que plantea Kress es que el mirar es una parte fundamental de dar sentido en estos momentos a la realidad, ¿no?
Right. Okay, and the last theory is an idea that comes from a philosopher, not a philosopher, a classic. J. Bolter is an American writer, and he comes from a classic background. And he talks about
la teoría de la remediación.
He's really talking about the relationship between the old and the new.
Y hablan de las relaciones entre lo viejo y lo nuevo.
So that digital media is not something completely new.
Los medios digitales no es algo completamente nuevo.
And he talks about the relationship between all of the different forms. So earlier media such as photography, film and television, they all refashion each other and remediate each other.
Sí, entonces lo que hacen es hablar de cómo se ha dado una nueva forma o se ha dado una nueva una nueva fashion, una nueva manera de aparecer a la fotografía, a la pintura, o sea, cómo la fotografía es una forma de imitar a la pintura, cómo las películas son una forma de imitar a la fotografía.
So the most important point here is that when we make meaning with new media, it's not something completely new. We are using the old ways of making meaning at the same time.
Entonces que lo digital no es algo completamente nuevo, sino que de alguna forma está dando significado, está remodelando o dándole nueva forma a cosas que ya se hacían antiguamente con otros medios.
Okay, now we're on to the end.
Y ya vamos hacia el final.
Okay, so I want to end now, and I hope that we can open up a discussion with some questions for you.
Son algunas preguntas para nosotros.
Okay.
A ver.
Here's the word you've all been waiting for. Spanish! Okay.
Por fin español.
Thank you very much. That was hard work. You were fantastic. This is what we're not sure, but there's been publishing companies are moving quite rapidly towards the production of ebooks. You know, last year it was 10% of their work. 40% of their work. So there's a rapid shift by the publishing industry, and they're going to be controlling what we do.
Right now, I saw your book in Amazon, and no in ebook. Happened here. Yeah. No in ebook. Yeah.
Every
Que hace
year.
unos años era solo el 10% lo que estaba produciendo en ebook en formato digital, y que ahora las editoriales australianas por lo menos ya están dice que a lo mejor exagera, pero en torno al 40%.
Who reads here? Who's got a Kindle? Anyone in the room got a Kindle? Yes, one Kindle owner. That's all. You?
Yeah.
¿Quién tiene un Kindle?
Or iPad, a tablet.
Un e-reader o un
Yeah, a
ebook.
tablet. No, a tablet. Any of you got tablets?
Un tablet.
Tablet, Kindle.
¿Quién tiene algún dispositivo que permita leer libros electrónicos?
Because the tablet is not good to read.
Not as
a
good
lot
as the
of
Kindle.
time. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's different.
And this is the job of an educator, to be a critical teacher, to
Trabajo de un educador es ser una
prepare people
persona
to
que
think about these things. To
prepara
say,
a la
look,
gente para que sea
look how
crítica.
this is shaping you.
Date
Look.
cuenta cómo esto está dando forma.
Yeah, it's exactly that. You manipulate Google, how people, there are experts everywhere in the world who, I'm sure you notice, that can manipulate Google to make sure that your company, or your brand, or your name comes up first in the list.
Es posible manipular Google para que, o sea, lo que la gente no sabe es que es posible manipular Google para que aparezca tu empresa en primera línea de... Cuando haces una búsqueda, sea lo primero que aparece tu empresa.
So at Monash University, I think, I'm not sure about this, but I think that if you put my name into Google, the first thing that comes up is Monash University, my website, my profile at Monash. So that's been manipulated to put that.
Aparece su perfil de Monash, está todo manipulado para...
Yeah, Monash did that. Monash did that to make sure. They paid
Monash ha
someone.
conseguido que esto ocurra de esta manera.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, well that's a very strong dominant argument that many people. But if Gunter Kress was here, sitting in this room, he'd do an I think one of the things he might do is an historical analysis to show that hundreds of years ago the visual was very important in communication. then with the invention of the printing press, the word became central, and now we're kind of almost going back to the way the visual was important. And one of the examples he always uses of the importance of the visual in history is the church, the stained glass windows in the church that tell the story about how you should live your life and what you should believe and what you should do and what you should think. And that was a very, very powerful visual message that's what people could do before they could read, the power of the image to control. So he traces the history of the way we represent and communicate with the visual to the printing press, the dominance of the printing press on the word, the logo central, and then back now. He shows that he does an analysis of textbooks, which is very, very interesting, of the 20th century science textbooks. You'll have to translate this, where the textbook for a science classroom at the beginning of the 20th century was all words. And then by the end of the 20th century, and if there were images, they were just an illustration, nothing else, to show. Nothing else. The word was what was important. And then he shows how in contemporary science textbooks, the image, the diagram, the visual is part of the meaning. You can't understand the science unless you understand the connection between the word and the visual. And that's his argument. That's one of his arguments. So that, you know, it's about what views dominate at what particular time. Standing back and looking at history, long, you know, 1,000 years or thousands of years, and you see changes and circles and recursion and all sorts of things. It's very interesting. He's a very interesting writer doing his historical analysis of the image. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.